Fei Chang Ni Hao, everybody. Today let's talk about education. So just because I work at a school does not mean that I am the expert at Chinese education. In fact, I work at such a special school that I am not sure what goes on in most Chinese schools. And that is why I decided to do it slightly differently. What I want to do today is talk about 10 different things that really interest me about my students. So 10 interesting facts about my students, but my students are not representative of the typical Chinese students because they all want to go abroad, so they don't take the Gaokao, for example. However, what I also want to do is one video later on about like what a typical day is like for me, a typical work day, and then what I want to try and do is do a video answering your questions. I have lots of friends and also family working in education, so if you have a question for me about what my work is like here, just let me know in the comments down below, and then I'll do my best to do a video, perhaps cruising through Shanghai on a mobike and answer your questions. But I'm not sure I can answer all of them, but I can do my best answering your questions. I do know a lot of things that, like secondhand, from colleagues and friends here who are teaching at different schools or have taught at different schools, so I do have some insights, but from my personal experience I cannot tell you that much just because my students are not typical Chinese students. So I teach at a high school, my students want to go abroad, and my students are very interesting. Let's get started, okay? So the first and foremost interesting difference that I noticed about my students is classroom management. Of course, you could have guessed that, and all the rumors are true. Classroom management here in China is not an issue with high school students. Students behave, and I think that there are several reasons for that. Of course, it is a big cultural difference. There is more respect for the teaching professionals, and generally teenagers have more respect for people who are older than them here in China. But I also believe that there is some sort of intrinsic acceptance in my students. I sense a sort of acceptance for the situation. They don't feel the need to fight every decision the teacher makes or everything that they have to do. For example, on a normal school day, my students don't ask themselves, do I really want to be here? Do I really want to do this? And so because they don't ask themselves this question every 5 minutes, they make their own life a lot easier. And I feel like the Dutch students could learn something from that, and perhaps other European students as well, because they often have to express their opinion and say, I don't want to do this, but that's all like besides the point. Nobody cares if you want to be here or not. It's just the way it is, and the Chinese have really got this sort of acceptance, I would say, of the situation. This is what's gonna happen. I know it's all for the greater good, so let's just get to business. So another interesting thing about my students is that they seem to be very intrinsically motivated, and they also seem to have more of an idea of where they want to go as to what profession they want or what university they want to go to. So they have future plans. Sometimes, as young as like primary school, they already have a path set out for them. And of course, the parents have a lot to do with this. Many children are still only just single children, so of course the parents and grandparents want to have a say in what happens with that child's future, especially because so much money has been put into their education sometimes. Many Dutch students, they don't really know what they want, and also in the Netherlands we have this option of, changing your studies without too much difficulty, and it's also not that expensive to study or go to university. So if you make a mistake or pick the wrong subject, it's no big deal. Whereas, for these Chinese students, of course, it's a big deal. So you don't want to fail, you want to keep going and make the right choice. So you really think about it. They really, think about their futures, and I really appreciate that. Another remarkable fact to me is how my students don't really have social lives, and that sounds kind of harsh. Of course they have friends and they hang out with their classmates, but there's just not a lot of time to socialize and have fun and do lots of stuff outside of school, because school lasts until 9 p.m. We have evening self-study, so the students simply don't have the time to go to a soccer club and make friends outside of school, and they also don't have their phones during the day. We take them, so yeah, there's not a lot of socializing going on except for with classmates, and there's something to be said for that, but of course also a lot to be said against it, because then at some point when these students do go to another country, maybe they don't have as many social skills and they haven't had boyfriends or girlfriends, so that's all very new and exciting and maybe a little scary for them. Having a boyfriend or a girlfriend is forbidden at my school. What I also find interesting about my students is that they are often a little reluctant to give their own personal opinion when asked. It's just because they're not used to be asked their opinion, and because they're afraid that their opinion is not the right opinion. But of course the whole idea of having an opinion is that it can be whatever you want it to be, as long as you have some sort of reason to feel the way you feel, it is okay. And that whole concept is sometimes a little bit difficult to you know, for them to grasp. And the Dutch students, I would say, are the opposite, and perhaps the English and in lots of other countries, students are the opposite, where they have their opinions ready even when you don't ask for them, and they can't stop talking. So when it comes to that, the Chinese are quite opposite. Woo. And then my next one ties in very well with the opinion is, students are really afraid to give the wrong answer, and often they actually are so focused on getting the right answer that they don't really seem to understand that it is about the learning process, or that we're trying to learn them or give them tools to figure stuff out with. They're so focused on the final answer, and I think that this ties in with a test mentality. Like, they are just focused on getting it right. So when you have math, of course, there is often one right answer, right? 1 and 1 equals 2. But with English literature, we discuss why this character does that, or why, like, here comes the spoiler, okay? So why in Of Mice and Men does George kill Lenny? Now, there are many reasons why, so, and I'm not gonna tell my students how many reasons there are. Figure it out. Tell me, what do you think? And because there's not one fixed answer, some students find that really difficult. Yo. So then yes, it is true that many students care more about the grade than about what they are really learning, although at my school we're trying really hard to change that and make them focus on like tools. What are you learning here? Explain what you're learning here. Know why it is useful, and that it's not just about getting an A or an A+. But that is a very Chinese mentality. It's about testing, doing scores, and they also have to do SATs and things, so their future is quite largely dependent on getting a good score. And for the average Chinese high school student, this is reflected in the Gaokao, that is like the pre-university exam that they take, and you just have to have a high score or else you can't get in. Now, of course, in the West, you also need to have good grades, but there are many more factors that universities look at. For example, what are your extracurriculars, and do you do any volunteer work, and what are your hobbies? Who are you as a person, and what makes you different from the rest? So there are many more things that we take into account. Chi. And so because students are so focused on what is true, what is false, and what is the score that I'm gonna get, the students sometimes fail to do some logical thinking, skills that perhaps their foreign counterparts develop a lot earlier on in life. Like what makes sense, common sense, sometimes seems to not be there. So that is something that is also quite difficult to teach, but we do have classes at my school to help them teach that, and to be a bit critical about what you read, form an opinion, why is that so, what makes sense. It's not always about numbers. With English, some words mean something different depending on the context. For example, I can really fancy a coffee right now, but I can also fancy a person. So often when you look up a word in the dictionary, well, what students do is they write down the first meaning of that word, but then within the story it might not make any sense at all. So they don't really have that skill yet, where they look at the context and figure out what something means. They have to have the dictionary, and then the first meaning they see is the one they write down, even when it doesn't make sense. Or what sometimes happens is that students write down a dictionary meaning, that they don't even understand. And of course that defeats the whole purpose of looking up a word. So for example, one word that I recently taught my students is to reprove, and when you look that up, the dictionary says rebuke. So then I ask my students, okay, great, what is rebuke? And then you often discover that they don't know. So they just write down a meaning that they also don't know. So then of course, you keep on looking or clicking until you find something that makes sense to you. But yeah, even though these students are sometimes 17, 18 years old, they haven't all mastered that skill yet, where they think for themselves, I'll just keep on clicking until I really know what it means. They just write down the dictionary meaning and then they think, okay, that will suffice. I'll write that down in a test. What have I really learned? I don't know. So that is interesting. Like, they will write down a definition on a test and then still not know what it means. So then what have you really learned? You can get an A+ by doing that, but it's a little useless when you don't know how to use the word. So often when I test vocabulary, I don't ask for like a direct synonym only. I want them to use the word in some sort of context so I can see that they really figured out what it means. Yeah, or explain it to me face to face. That also helps. Ba. So this next one might sound a little bit mean, but I don't mean that it is the student's fault. It's personal hygiene. Not all students are nasty or smelly or whatever, but some students are definitely not that clean. They don't seem to know how to properly take care of themselves. Their personal hygiene can be a little bad. And I mean that with girls and when they're on their period, some of them might not be sure what's going on with their bodies. And with the boys and also girls, sometimes they're just a bit smelly, or they wear the same shoes for a whole week and then of course their feet just start to smell. I'm not sure how often they change their socks. I don't know if they clean their face before they come to school, and some they don't brush their teeth. They just wake up and go to school just like that without glancing at the mirror. And I don't blame these students, I blame the system, because we don't have any classes here that teach the students how to properly take care of your body. It's as if the body is a taboo subject. So there is also no sex ed, for example, no education about sex, and that really worries me. So I will try to introduce it at my school, and I think it might happen that at least a couple of afternoons I get to talk to the girls about certain things. I want to talk about these things with my students, but many of these topics are taboo. For example, so I talk to my boss and I can talk about sex with the grade 12s who go to the United States next year, so that is really good. But I'm still not allowed to talk about being gay, which I might do anyway, so you'll find out soon enough if I get fired for that or not, because to me that is just part of life, and I'm not necessarily gonna tell them all to agree with me. Nobody has to have my opinion, and my students know that, but they need to know about what exists out there in the world and what real life is like. So I really do believe that students should talk about these things, should learn about these things. Joe! And then I want to say that I guess partially because there is no education about sex or personal hygiene here, students have this extreme sort of innocence over them. Like, they live in this bubble where sex doesn't exist, where girlfriends and boyfriends are not allowed. So all of these things are very far from their beds, whereas back home, students who are like 16, 17, you know exactly at school which student is dating whom, and who has a party that weekend, and you also know that they drink alcohol, because in the Netherlands teenagers do those things and they experiment, and that's okay, if you ask me. But of course, so my students are boarding school students, most of them anyways, so they live at the dorms, and there are always people watching them, right? Big Brother is always watching, so they don't have the chance to experiment or to go out in the real world. I'm pretty sure that there is no chance that they can go into Shanghai proper and go party. I'm not sure if it happens actually, but I don't think so. They're very protected, almost overprotected. Shit. My last topic ties in with that as well. So the students in China, or at least my students, let's keep it to what I know and my experience. So my students, they are not very streetwise, and this is almost like everything I've said prior to this ties in with it, because they don't have that critical thinking ability, although we are trying to teach them that, and my students they're pretty good. But still, like figuring stuff out for yourself, by yourself, where to go, how things work, what makes sense, all of those things, they contribute to a sense of awkwardness. Sometimes they don't seem to be very streetwise because they're also so protected. So I would say that because they are not exposed to because they're not exposed too much, like, I don't know, you know how the censorship is here in China, right? That movie with the lady and the water, what is it called? That movie that just came out not too long ago? They cut out so many scenes here. My students are just so innocent because they're not exposed to a lot, and that is within school, so they don't have sex education and they don't learn about personal hygiene much, but also in the media, like the censorship in China has a lot to do with it, because nudity and stuff, that's all cut out from the movies here, and you know, political disagreement does not exist and things like that. So they're kept really, really young, small, and I feel like a lot of things are going to be so tempting for them when they go abroad, and I hope that they don't go crazy on the alcohol or on the, I don't know what. It's just that because they're so overprotected, they're also very innocent and ignorant. Yeah, I would say ignorant. So I hope that I can change some of that. Of course, I'm not going to expose them to a lot of violence, but I hope to, you know, talk to them about what the real world is like, because they don't always seem to know that, just because, yeah, they go to that school of mine where they are on campus all the time, or pretty much all the time. So it's cold and it's windy, so I gotta stop now. But thank you so much for watching. If you have questions about my work, about my high school students here in Shanghai, or about education, and you wonder what else I know, just ask me in the comments down below, and I will incorporate that in one of my next videos. Thank you so much for watching. I'm gonna put my coat back on, and oh my gosh. Thank you so much for watching. 再见大家.